Welcome to Lunch at the Library, our end of the year event, and this is a wonderful turnout, and we have a wonderful speaker for you. Before we get started, though, I do want to introduce the new director of the library. He's not so new anymore, but Ryan Weber is here to say a few words. Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks, Leslie. It's funny, on the way up here, I was riding the elevator with Vicki, and we talked about whether or not I could still consider myself new. It's been exactly a year since I started, so I'll take the new moniker as long as I can because I think it carries some benefits. But I want to welcome you to our program today, to our lunch at the library. What a great event. It's incredible to me that at midday in downtown Lincoln, we can get a healthy crowd like this, 30, 35 folks to hear about some recent books and to share your love for reading and literature. And I think that we're also lucky to have the NLHA, which has been around for 40 plus years at this point. So thank you to our NLHA board and everyone who serves to make this event happen, and to our Library Foundation. Again, so glad to see you. Can't wait to keep up this. We have, I'm sure, many great programs coming forward in the future, too. So, thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. Yes, we sure do. So we're taking a break in January, but in February we'll be back with Ted Wheeler. His new novel is The War Begins in Paris. And in March we have Carla Kettner, her new children's book about Ted Koozer's life, More Than a Local Wonder. And then we have something that we need to tie down for April, but it's going to be a good one. So thanks for coming this year, and we look forward to next year. Well, this is the sesquicentennial of Willa Cather's birth. And tomorrow, December 7th, is actually her birthday, so how appropriate that we should have Melissa Homestead here with us today. Melissa is the professor of English and program faculty in Women's and Gender Studies at UNL. She's a graduate of Smith College and the University of Pennsylvania. She's published widely on American women's writing and authorship from the late 1700s to the early 1900s. Melissa is the director of the Cather Project and the co-editor of the Complete Letters of Willa Cather, a digital edition. So please welcome Melissa.
Yeah, with my last name being Homestead, it's easy to make that mistake. So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be presenting to you in honor of Willa Cather's 150th birthday about my book, The Only Wonderful Things, The Creative Partnership of Willa Cather and Edith Lewis, which was published in April of 2021. If you're interested in more events, including tomorrow, if anyone likes beer, the Zipline Beer Hall is O-Pie and Beers. Yes, it's a pun. Emily Rao, who's in the back there, is in charge of that event. And you can find more about Cather 150 events on the website of the National Willa Cather Center, which is willacather.org. My presentation today is going to be in two parts. First, I'll give an overview of my book, chapter by chapter, accompanied by images. And then, in light of the publication of a recent trade biography that returns to the old theory that Cather's sexuality is some sort of enigma, I'll offer some remarks on why some persist in maintaining that there's no evidence of Cather's lesbianism. In terms of historical interpretation, then, what properly counts as evidence of queerness in the past, and why has it been hard to see Edith Lewis for who she was and what she was in Cather's life? And that's Willa Cather and Edith Lewis and Jaffrey in 1926. Those questions will drive the second half of my talk, but first I'll begin my overview. So there are two strands of argument throughout my book, signaled in the title by the phrase creative partnership. First, that as two ambitious career women, Cather and Lewis created a romantic and domestic partnership that allowed them to enjoy love and intimacy and to pursue their career ambitions. The second is that as an editor, Lewis was a partner in Cather's creative process and also used her expertise in advertising to help craft Cather's image as an author. And this is a page from The Professor's House, her novel of 1925, and all of the handwriting is Edith Lewis's. My book starts and ends at the old burying ground in Jaffrey, New Hampshire, where Cather and Lewis are buried side by side. I hope that by the end of the book, I have succeeded in undoing the mythology about the gravesite that has obscured Lewis's place in Cather's life. The idea that Edith Lewis was buried at Cather's feet, which she was not. Having started at the end with my own first visit to Jaffrey in the autumn of 1984 when I was a college student, I turn the clock back, introducing Edith Lewis as the young woman Willa Cather first met in Lincoln, Nebraska in August 1903 in the home of Sarah Harris, which is not too far from here on K Street, publisher of the Lincoln Courier. That's probably not Sarah herself, it's probably her mother and her brother standing in front of the house after it was radically sort of rebuilt around 1903. Delving briefly into Lewis's New England family history, I paint a picture of her family's life in Nebraska before she emerged into public view as an adolescent studying at the University of Nebraska. She's in the front row on the right there with her sorority, Delta Gamma, when she was a Nebraska student, and publishing short stories in the Lincoln Courier. She transferred to Smith College in Massachusetts. She's in the back row there with her literary society, where she met Uxa Barlow, who is an important character in the book, and from which Lewis graduated in 1902. Chapter 2 follows Lewis to New York City, where she moved after a year back in Lincoln teaching school. This is 60 South Washington Square. It's the building on, not the corner, but the one 2 down from it on the left with the curved lintel over the door. And that is where Willa Cather moved when she moved to New York in 1906. But first, Edith Lewis moved there. I traced the growth of her relationship with Cather, both personal and professional, from their first meeting in 1903 through about 1918 in this first chapter. From 1906, both Cather and Lewis worked at McClure's magazine, and I argue that the magazine office was the crucible of their collaborative work on Cather's fiction. This slide here shows actually a poem that Cather published in McClure's magazine, and all of the handwriting, again, revising the poem, is Edith Lewis's. I also argue that Cather and Lewis, in choosing to make a home together in 1908, and this is the apartment building they moved into in an apartment together there off Washington Square, were emulating Sarah Orne Jewett and Annie Fields. Here they are in the home they shared in Boston. Jewett was a novelist, Annie Fields was a hostess, identified by most scholars as the prototypical Boston marriage. In any event, after Cather left McClure's, Lewis moved on to Every Week magazine, and I recover Lewis's work as an editor of fiction there, including as a context for understanding Cather's fiction. In these 2 slides, you may recognize the slide on the right as an illustration by W.T. Benda of the character Lena Lingard out standing in the prairie knitting. And on the left is a story when Edith Lewis was fiction editor and working with artists to illustrate fiction. It's W.T. Benda illustrations, the same artist, the same woman in the same dress in a story about the Great Plains. And by the way, in 2 weeks, I'm going to get Lena Lingard knitting tattooed on my right forearm. And I'm not joking. In Chapter 3, I turn the clock back to 1915 to tell the story of Cather and Lewis's 4 shared trips to the U.S. Southwest. Here they are at Mesa Verde at Cliff Palace in 1915. Throughout the book, Lewis's editing of Cather's fiction is a key theme, but I linger over the evidence in this chapter because the first surviving edited type draft of one of Cather's novels is The Professor's House, and here it is again, which was grounded in their 1915 and 1916 trips to the Southwest. And I sometimes say that my whole book is really just a book about the editing of The Professor's House, and that's not entirely a joke either. Their Southwestern travels in 1925 and 1926. Here is a map that Edith Lewis drew based on some of their travels. Inspired Death Comes for the Archbishop. And here they are on horseback in 1925, probably. Although there is no type draft of that novel, Death Comes for the Archbishop, there is a record of their travel and literary collaboration. After mining the record of their experiences together in the desert Southwest, I focus in Chapter 4 on Lewis's career as an advertising copywriter at the J. Walter Thompson Company. This is one of my favorite things. On the left, you'll see a later part of the story, Uncle Valentine, that Willa Cather published in the Woman's Home Companion in 1925. On the right, you will see, in the way that magazines do what's called ad stripping, right? What you have there on the right is an advertisement for which Edith Lewis wrote the copy. It's for Jergens lotion, for hand lotion. So, I argue that her advertising copy for soap and hand lotion and Cather's fiction are in conversation with one another. I also hypothesize, and there they are quite literally on the same page, I also hypothesize that Lewis was behind the famous Edward Steichen portrait of Cather published in Vanity Fair in 1927. Lewis worked extensively with Steichen on advertising campaigns, and if you look at the photo on the left, it's pretty tiny to see, but it says Steichen under Cather's portrait, and then on the right, again, a Jergens lotion advertisement, and Edward Steichen took the picture of a woman's hands kneading dough. And the whole idea behind the advertising campaign, for which Edith Lewis wrote all of the copy, was that you could do your housework, this is for middle-class women, and still then have beautiful hands for your husband when he came home. Lewis started in advertising in 1919, and she and Cather first summered on Grand Manan Island in 1922. This is pictures of the two of them around 1922 on Grand Manan Island. I devote a separate chapter to their many summers there, both before and after they built their own cottage at Whale Cove. This is a little photograph. They started building it in 26, first occupied it in 28. Edith Lewis did watercolor avocationally, and she watercolored the photograph, and Willa Cather wrote at the top of the picture, "This is our little home." So there's their cottage. Cather has been portrayed as living in isolation on the island, but she was living with Lewis, who was actually the legal owner of the land and the cottage. Furthermore, at Whale Cove, they were part of a community of women, and only women. In this chapter, I focus both on their collaborative work on the stories collected in Obscure Destinies, which was published in 1932, and this is all Edith Lewis's editing of the story Two Friends, and how both of them responded to the deaths of their parents in the 1920s and early 1930s. And these two things are related. I also see them as moving past grief in the 1930s by inviting sisters and nieces to visit them on Grand Manan Island. And this is Cather with Mary Virginia Auld, her niece, in the early 1930s. In my last full chapter, I take them back to New York City, where they settled into a large apartment at 570 Park Avenue in 1932. And this is 570 Park Avenue. In 1927, and my friend Amy back there, the first time I ever actually went to 570 Park Avenue, I don't know why it took me so long, she took the photograph of me standing under the awning of the apartment building. In 1927, they had lost their Greenwich Village apartment to subway construction and camped out in an apartment hotel for 5 years before leasing another apartment. They made their lives together there and built relationships with each other's families and with the Menuhin family. So Yehudi Menuhin is the one you may have heard of, the violinist. His sisters Yalta and Hepzibah were also musicians. Both of them, Willa Cather and Edith Lewis, died in this apartment, 25 years apart. Appropriately, Lewis's profound grief at Cather's death occupies a significant portion of my final chapter. The years after Cather's 1947 death correspond to the Cold War panic over homosexuality called by one historian, Cather's death, sorry, there's the gravestone, corresponds to the Cold War panic over homosexuality called by one historian the Lavender Scare. In my epilogue, I consider how this context enabled some to deny Cather's lesbian sexuality and to refuse to see Lewis for what she was and what she had been in Cather's life. Now to turn to these questions of evidence and historical interpretation. Some have devoted considerable energy to refuting the idea that Cather was a lesbian, claiming that those who characterize her as such are being ahistorical and projecting their own desires onto the past. As a lesbian myself, I have long found this particular line of argument frustrating. And although I didn't take up the question in this way in my book, I want to spend some time here refuting those claims and calling out the larger problem of double standards of evidence of sexuality in the presence of lesbians in the past. Cather and Lewis's relationship was tacitly accepted among their friends and family, and mid-20th century critics and biographers clearly knew she was a lesbian, but they were careful not to say so publicly. They did say so in letters to each other. However, Cather was only officially outed by two late 20th century biographies, Phyllis Robinson's Willa, published in 1993, and Sharon O'Brien's Willa Cather, The Emerging Voice, published in 1987. In the wake of O'Brien's biographies and reading of Cather's fiction relying on it, some vigorously identified her identification of Cather as lesbian. These denials often took the form of dismissals of such identification as merely conjecture or speculation in the absence of evidence of sexual activities, whatever that means. That's part of my question. Others went further, suggesting that the explanation for the identification of Cather as a lesbian lay with biographers and critics themselves. Joan Acocella first advanced this position in an article in The New Yorker, which she expanded in Willa, Cather and the Politics of Criticism, published in 2000. Acocella portrays the identification of Cather as a lesbian in biography and criticism from the 1980s forward as an act of aggression by feminist critics against an essentially conservative author whose life and works displeased them. Labeling Cather a lesbian was, she claims, a stick of dynamite feminists needed to blow Cather's world open. Anyway, Acocella concedes that Cather was likely homosexual in her feelings and celibate in her actions. Nevertheless, even what seemed to be Cather's open expressions of love for other women are evidence that she was not homosexual or not in her actions because she felt she had nothing to hide. There has, of course, been a sea change in attitudes towards homosexuality since the publication of O'Brien's biography in 1987, and even since the publication of Acocella's book in 2000. Consider especially the rapid transformation of the law to allow for same-sex marriage. Despite this change, however, in a New Yorker blog post, Joan Acocella used the argument of Willa Cather and used the publication of the selected letters of Willa Cather in 2013 to rehash the argument of Willa Cather in the Politics of Criticism. In her will, Cather prohibited the quoting from or publication of her letters, and as a result, until that policy changed shortly before the publication of the selected letters, scholars had to resort to paraphrase of letters. Acocella thus added a new claim to her critique of O'Brien's supposed mishandling of evidence, that her cognitive bias in favor of identifying Cather as a lesbian caused her to misrepresent key language in her paraphrase of one letter. Acocella does not specify the source of O'Brien's supposed cognitive bias. And frankly, what she means that isn't clear. I think what she really meant was confirmation bias, which in sort of social sciences is a form of cognitive bias. Anyway, she leaves her readers to fill in the supposed blanks that O'Brien was projecting contemporary identity politics onto an inappropriate object in the past because O'Brien herself was a lesbian. She isn't, by the way, and in fact wrote and published an essay in the 1980s on her sense of dis-ease about being a straight woman writing lesbian biography and how she might have projected her straight assumptions onto Cather's life. So she actually wrote exactly the opposite. In Acocella's blog post responding to the publication of the selected letters, she turns to Cather's fiction as evidence of the author's lack of sexual experiences, the lack of any romantic or sexual glow in Cather's portrayals of heterosexual love and romance in her fiction, and the absence of any sex going on in her portrayals of same-gender bonds are evidence, Acocella claims, that Cather may have died a virgin. So Acocella doesn't pause to puzzle out what the concept of virginity might have meant for a woman whose sexual experiences were all with other women. Furthermore, she and others who continue to deny Cather's lesbianism never articulate what would count as evidence, although it seems they conflate sexuality with sexual activities. It would seem they require no such proof of heterosexuality. When reconstructing the life of either partner in a heterosexual marriage, do scholars need to provide such evidence in order to prove heterosexual identity? Absent genetic testing, can we even be sure that children are evidence of sexual intercourse between a husband and wife? Or must we always remain open to the possibility that the wife was carrying on an affair with the mailman while the husband was carrying on an affair with the man next door? And quite seriously, if anybody knows people who've taken genetic tests now and they find out the family secrets, you think you know who your parents are and you don't, right? And as in marriage, in any event, defined purely by sexual activities in the most limited sense, is that marriage, or is marriage defined by sexuality in a broader sense by love, affection, and intimacy? In both her book and her blog post, Acocella assumes that the entire biographical case for Cather's lesbianism rests on a single letter from Cather to Louise Pound. And there they are, in the early 1890s, Cather on the right, Louise Pound on the left, the object of Cather's intense college crush. With the letter in Cather's own words published for all to read, Acocella claims the case for Cather's lesbianism evaporates. The fact that Cather shared homes in her life with Edith Lewis from 1908 through 1947 is evidence of nothing, it would seem. And for Acocella, Cather's glorious love letter to Lewis, written in 1936, 28 years after they first moved in together, and which also appeared in the selected letters, and from which I derived the title of my book, this letter, is of no significance. If Cather had lived with a man for nearly 40 years, would anyone be cavilling about evidence? A decade after Acacella's last contribution to this faux debate about Cather's sexuality, why does it continue to be so hard for some people to let Willa Cather be queer, both to herself and the world? In Chasing Bright Medusas, A Life of Willa Cather, a new book currently receiving much praise, Benjamin Taylor treats Cather's sexuality as an enigma. On Cather's sexuality during her years as a student at the University of Nebraska, for example, he writes, Willa saw herself as exceptional rather than homosexual. But that she was homosexual is obvious, astounded though she would have been to know it. So she doesn't know herself. He gives some attention to a woman he calls Cather's great love, Isabel McClung Hamburg, as he does to Edith Lewis, whom he characterizes as but the other love. However, he also gives great weight to what he describes as Cather's antipathy to sexual love in her fiction, and by implication, her life. Sex is the worm in the apple, he writes. Unhappy marriages predominate, and sexual need is the flaw in human nature. She was against it. Her great protagonists rise above it. I mean, does anyone actually care whether there are unhappy marriages in F. Scott Fitzgerald or Ernest Hemingway and whether that is important for their biographies? No, but this is the double standard. Notably, Taylor's account of Lewis is scant and error-filled. He fails to mention her role as Cather's editor, shaping her late style he so admires, and he closes the book with the debunked idea that Lewis is buried at Cather's feet. In Maureen Corrigan's review of Taylor's book, featured on the front page of the Washington Post books, she celebrates the recognition Cather is receiving this year, the 150th anniversary of her birth. And drawing on Taylor, she also leans into the supposed inscrutability of Cather's sexuality, calling Taylor an especially nuanced commentator on the vexed was she or wasn't she question of Willa Cather's sexuality. Corrigan suggests that Cather wished to be done with sex and carnal desire so that she could devote sustained effort into making herself a great artist. Again, I ask the question, if Cather had lived openly with a man for as long as she lived with Edith Lewis, would anyone find Cather's sexual identity and the nature of the relationship a mystery? By claiming Cather's queerness, I'm not trying to turn her into a role model. I don't think she would like me or be my friend if she came back from the dead. Nor am I I'm not trying to turn her into a role model, nor am I suggesting that the common readers who are ready to explore Cather's life and work, and to whom Corrigan recommends Taylor's book, must read Cather's fiction through her sexuality. It's Taylor, like Joan Acacella, who does that. An accurate account of Cather's life and her relationship with Lewis is my concern. The letter to university classmate Louise Pound that grounds Taylor's claim that Cather thought of herself as exceptional rather than homosexual, and the same letter on which Joan Acacella focuses, is, as he accurately characterizes it, a profession of love. However, he also claims that the letter is about love at its most exalted above the reach of mere carnality, and that no other letter like it survives. Even though Corrigan characterizes Taylor's account of this letter, including his equivocations, like she wouldn't know that she herself was homosexual, that stuff, as typical of Taylor's rigorous effort to fathom how Cather understood herself, neither of Taylor's claims about the letter is accurate. Oops. The letter begins with a paragraph of Cather's comments about how very handsome she found Louise Pound in her French couture gown, that's a Worth costume, the evening before. And it's followed by a paragraph in which she says 3 times how queer she felt. I wanted very much to ask you to go through the customary goodbye formality, she explains, meaning she wanted to hug and kiss her when she left a party. But I thought it might disgust you a little, so I didn't. In the following yearning run-on sentence, Cather again expresses her desire to have hugged and kissed Pound the evening before, and imagines a time in the future when both of them might laugh at Cather's intense feelings. How is this a letter about love above the reach of mere carnality? It is all about Louise Pound's body. So, certainly, this letter to Pound and others she wrote to her in the 1890s suggest that Pound did not reciprocate Cather's feelings. But Cather had most of her life ahead of her. Like, I wrote letters like this when I was 20 years old, and they do not characterize the rest of my life, right? They're beginning, they're not the end. So she had most of her life ahead of her, including the years that she lived with Edith Lewis. Is Cather's beautiful, subtly erotic 1936 letter, here it is again, addressed to my darling Edith, from which I took the title of my book, Not a Profession of Love. A profession of love written to a woman with whom she had been living for 28 years at the time she wrote it. Several times, Taylor uses the odd, archaic term connubial to describe Cather and Lewis's relationship. I mean, who even knows what that means? I'm not sure he knows. Why not lesbian? So in Proust, The Search, his biography of Marcel Proust, Taylor has no difficulty recognizing Proust's homosexuality, but lesbians, it seems, are harder to see. Perhaps Cather's anti-modernism and childhood and adolescence in Nebraska, both central to Taylor's reading of her life in fiction, make her queerness seem inscrutable. If, as common wisdom holds, queer folks flee small towns to major coastal cities and lesbianism is a modern invention, then Cather, despite her own career trajectory away from Nebraska, couldn't be queer. Such cultural assumptions fail to account for the diversity of Midwestern and rural experience in the past or today. As an adolescent in the 1880s and 1890s in Red Cloud and Lincoln, Cather presented to the world as William Cather, hair cropped short and dressed in boyish or mannish clothing. In 1893, William began to fade as the cropped hair grew long, and the feminine presenting Willa Cather emerged, living as a woman who formed romantic attachments with other women. So, 150 years after Cather's birth, it's time to stop the endless recycling of the idea that Cather's sexuality is a mystery and all of this cavilling about evidence. She was here in Nebraska, Pittsburgh, New York City, many places she traveled. She was here. We should just get used to it. Thanks. Questions?
Are you going to Red Cloud tomorrow?
No, we have events here in Lincoln. I am on the board of governors at the National Willa Cather Center, so I know all about the events. In fact, there's going to be an online event with Benjamin Taylor about his book, and I'm going to be one of the respondents.
Excellent, thank you.
But that one costs money. That's a $25 pay to I think they probably will put it up on YouTube later, but. Yes?
They recently had a documentary on public television regarding her life. And there was a little innuendo into it, but they didn't really go into that. But everybody forgets about the fact that she was wealthy, that she donated money, that she provided a lot of help to a lot of charities because of her wealth. You forget about that. Why focus on this?
Those aren't mutually exclusive any more than feeling that she was exceptional and homosexual are mutually exclusive, right? So she didn't donate a lot of money to charity. She donated a lot of money to individuals during the Great Depression. So I don't think there's any conflict between those two things. And she really wasn't wealthy until the 1930s. Right. That's when the money really hit, right? And you probably saw an old documentary, Willa Cather, The Road Is All, which was actually filmed more than 20 years ago.
Oh, no, I don't think so.
Yeah.
Maybe it was, I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's the, right. I mean, the more recent, shorter documentary, which was from about 10 years ago, is Yours, Willa Cather, and I appear in that documentary. But the earlier one was from, I think more than 20 years ago. Anybody else?
The timing on the article in this morning's paper, I thought was very appropriate for you to come here today to me.
Well, we're all keyed to Willa Cather's birthday tomorrow, right? So that's exactly it. Her actual birthday is tomorrow, and the childhood home, which has been under renovation for more than a year, is reopened. They really, the last time that it was, rehabilitated, nobody quite knew what they were doing. And so the work by current standards for historic preservation was quite primitive. But they also just, I mean, I've heard reports from the staff about they found like weird objects inside the walls that were actual sort of Cather items that somehow were inside the walls. So they just really found a whole bunch of interesting stuff rehabilitating that building. And they're also going to, I haven't seen it yet, but some of the old interpretation conflated Willa Cather's life and her works, right? So you would have, say, the name of a character who was kind of like Willa Cather on an object, right? So that you were basically walking through Willa Cather's fiction. Now, although they recognize the relationship between her fiction and the place, they're very careful about the place as a historic location and not misrepresenting anything as far as what the place was when Willa Cather's family lived there in the 1880s and 90s. Yes?
Can you expound on the items found in the walls?
I can't remember. I heard about this months ago, but it was sort of, Cather family related material. So, yeah, I'm sure that it will be on display, but I haven't seen it yet because they just reopened the building. But it really was just they found like they removed dust and then they had to sift through the dust. There was so much sort of just like dust accumulated between the plaster and the outside that they just had to sift through, and they just sort of like found things when they were removing all of this dust. Yes?
What difference does it make what she was in her personal life? She was an excellent author. Nobody goes back and says he was an excellent homosexual author. Why should they say she's an excellent lesbian author? Why can't she just be a good author? And why are people building their whole careers around identifying whatever she did in the bedroom? That to me is just stupid. I'm sorry. Just, she's a good author.
Well, I
She's a
think
great
that
author.
your comment is stupid because I think that you are trying to deny a history. This is about a history. As I said, I'm not about interpreting her works through this, but her history is important as any person's history, and the ways that her life has been denied in biographies, which are about her personal life, right? So biographies are about her. And to insist that you don't want to look into her bedroom, when you talk about anybody's marriage, you're looking into their bedroom, right? Well, just saying they're married is a claim about the bedroom, right? They didn't have the ability to get married. So this kind of response, for me, it's like you're saying you don't get a pass. I get a pass. I get to presume heterosexuality for everybody, and you just be quiet. And I'm not, that is what I hear in your remarks.
I am saying that regardless of that title of homosexual or lesbian should have nothing to do with her writing, because it's her writing that's important.
Well, I think her life is important too. And there are biographies that are about her life. So I'm not saying you have to read her work through this, but I'm saying let's have a reckoning about her life. That is what I'm saying. Yes?
Who died first, and can you tell us anything about the survivor's life?
So Willa Cather died in 1947. Edith Lewis died in 1972, which for me is weird because she was alive when I was alive. That's not true in most cases. For me, on the authors I work with, they were dead long before I was born. So Edith Lewis was Willa Cather's literary executor. She spent a lot of time working with the first authorized biographer. She published a book about Cather as well, worked on managing publication of some unpublished works. She also traveled. She had friends. She did other things. The last 10 years of her life, she was in extremely poor health. She had enough resources to stay in her home, and her financial resources were not all inherited from Willa Cather. She had been a highly compensated professional woman. She had a trust income from an aunt. So she had private nursing care for the last 10 years of her life, and it was pretty brutal. And in fact, she was subject essentially to elder abuse by her last live-in nurse, who manipulated her, kept her isolated, got control of her finances. So that's a little bit of that's in my book, but that was the hardest thing to find out, was what happened in the last 7 years of her life. Yes, Pat?
Melissa, can you talk a little bit about, kind of following up on some of the other questions? I'm not sure I can articulate this, but what are the circumstances in which, as you're studying a work, you just look at the work? And then what are the circumstances where the life of the author or the culture in which it was written are as much a part of the study? Is that even, I hope I'm articulating that well.
Right. And as I said, I'm not saying that you have to read her work through, but let me just flip back here, though. I mean, I think if you're interested in Cather's works and you see this, you got to think, who picked up that pen and edited Cather's work, right? Who did she trust to intervene in her creative process in that way? So that's a central concern of my book. And the ways that Cather and Lewis's experiences together, traveling in the Southwest and such, were source material for her fiction, right? So I think you can see that. But methodologically, there's a whole bunch of different ways that you could slice that. Like I said, my book is about Cather's creative process, about experiences that informed her fiction, but is not primarily about interpreting her fiction. So it's biography. Yes?
Can you remind me why she was buried there versus in Red Cloud?
Well, only one of her siblings was buried in Red Cloud, so there's no special reason that she should have been buried in Red Cloud. All of them left Red Cloud. All of her siblings left Red Cloud. 3 of her siblings, I think, are buried in California, which is where they lived. Elsie Cather is buried with her parents. She lived in Lincoln for most of her life as an adult. She left no instructions for Edith Lewis. I mean, one of the things I discovered in my research that you will not find in any other biography, and which is not in Benjamin Taylor's book, is that Willa Cather had breast cancer. And in fact, she had metastatic cancer at the time she died. You would think that that would be a reason to have the hard conversations about your wishes, but they clearly didn't have those conversations. And I can understand that too. You just want to pretend it's not going to happen. So, Lewis, after Cather died, that I think she once said she wanted to be buried up in Jaffrey because she did a lot of writing there. And so she had to make that decision, based on all of the life that she lived with her. But she did, she just made a choice. And then she herself specified in her will that she wanted to be buried in the same grave plot, which she had purchased when Willa Cather died. And Edith Lewis also had family relationships in New Hampshire, so her father was from New Hampshire. Yes?
What was the age differential between these 2 women? Do you know that?
7 years.
7, okay.
Which is probably why they didn't meet in Lincoln. And also during part of Cather's time in Lincoln at the university, Edith Lewis's family was actually out in Kearney because her father was appointed a bank receiver. Cather did have, Louise Pound was considerably younger than her. Louise Pound, in fact, is about the same age as Edith Lewis. And Louise Pound and Edith Lewis knew each other as children in Lincoln. But yeah, so that's the age difference.
The Pound name, that lady, is that the Cather Pound?
What, sorry?
At the university, you had the dorms that were named.
Oh, Cather and Pound were torn down.
Right.
And now they made, the old business building is now Louise Pound Hall, and the new dining commons is Willa Cather.
Okay, I wondered.
But yes, that was, that was the origin of those names. No, it wasn't Louise Pound who was younger than, I'm sorry, Dorothy Canfield was much younger than Willa Cather. Okay. Thank you.
Melissa, I would just like to thank you so much for coming and sharing your book with us today and telling us a little bit about your hard work and your passion for what you do. And on behalf of the Heritage Room and NLHA and Lincoln City Libraries, this is just a little token of our appreciation.
Oh, thank you.
And thank you for being here and celebrating Nebraska authors with us.